The first light of dawn had always held a peculiar power over Eleanor Whitcombe, daughter of the Duke of Ashworth. In the hours before the household stirred, before the maids scurried across polished floors and the clamor of breakfast echoed through the grand halls, she found a stillness that belonged only to her. It was during these moments, when the estate lay hushed beneath a veil of silver mist, that Eleanor felt most alive. Her chamber windows overlooked the vast paddocks, where the horses stood like quiet sentinels, their breaths curling into the chill air. Eleanor had adored them since childhood, their strength, their elegance, the way their hooves struck the earth with a rhythm that seemed to echo in her own heartbeat. Yet for all her affection, her father had forbidden her to ride. "A lady of your standing," the Duke would often say, "must never be seen astride a horse like some farm girl. You will have carriages, Eleanor, and gentlemen to escort you. Leave the rough pursuits to those born for them." But Eleanor was not content to leave it. For months she had carried a secret, folded like a letter within her heart. At the first break of dawn, long before her lady's maid entered to lace her corset or select her gowns, Eleanor would slip from her chamber in a simple cloak and boots. She moved like a shadow through the servants' passageways, down the worn stone steps, until the crisp air of the courtyard struck her cheeks. It was here, in the dimly lit stables, that she first saw him. Thomas Hale, the boy, or rather, the young man, was a stable hand, perhaps 2 or 3 years her senior. Broad of shoulder though lean, with the roughened hands of one accustomed to work. His dark hair fell in untamed strands across his brow, and there was always a guarded stillness in his gaze, as if he listened more than he ever spoke. Eleanor had expected disapproval when she first asked to be taught how to ride. But Thomas had not scolded, nor had he bowed with obsequious deference like so many of the staff. He had only studied her, his brow furrowed, as though measuring the truth of her request. "You'll fall," he had said at last. "Then you must teach me not to." And from that morning, the lessons began. Now, weeks into their secret arrangement, Eleanor moved with greater confidence. She led the mare into the mist-laden field, her fingers curled around the reins, her heart thrumming in anticipation. The air was cold enough to sting, but within her chest a fire burned bright. She mounted clumsily at first, but Thomas was there, steadying her with a sure hand. His touch was brief, no more than was needed, but Eleanor felt it linger, like the echo of a bell long after the strike. The horse shifted beneath her, restless and eager. Thomas stepped back, his expression unreadable in the faint light. "Remember," he said quietly, his voice low and roughened from years of early mornings. "Breathe with her. She feels every tremor, every doubt. She'll only trust you if you trust yourself." Eleanor nodded, though her pulse raced with exhilaration and fear in equal measure. She urged the mare forward, and the ground began to move beneath her. The rhythm rose, a steady cadence, like a drumbeat carrying her beyond the reach of duty, beyond the walls of the estate. Wind caught at her hair, pulling loose strands from their pins. For a moment, she felt weightless, untethered from the rules that bound her. When at last she slowed, her laughter spilled into the morning air, unrestrained and genuine. She turned, flushed and breathless, to find Thomas watching her, not with amusement, as others might have, but with an intensity that seemed to root her to the saddle. His eyes were darker than the soil, reflecting something she could not name. "You're learning," he said simply. "And you doubted me," she teased, though her voice trembled slightly under his gaze. For a moment longer he stood there, as though words hovered on his lips but refused to take shape. Then he turned, busying himself with the tack, his silence both frustrating and strangely compelling. It was in that silence Eleanor found herself wondering who Thomas Hale truly was. He spoke little of himself, offering only what necessity demanded. But sometimes, when he believed she was not watching, she caught the shadow of some unspoken memory crossing his features, a fleeting bitterness, a grief that did not belong to a mere stable boy. There were scars, too, faint but undeniable along his forearms, the sort one did not acquire in the service of horses. Eleanor had noticed them when his sleeves slipped back, though she had not dared ask. Not yet. The bell of the chapel tolled distantly, pulling her back to the present. Morning had fully broken. Soon the household would stir, and if she were discovered in the fields astride a horse, or worse, in the company of Thomas, the consequences would be severe. Reluctantly, Eleanor dismounted, her boots sinking into the damp earth. Thomas stepped forward to take the reins, his fingers brushing hers only briefly, yet enough to send a quiet tremor through her. "You must go," he murmured, not looking at her. "They'll notice your absence." She hesitated, watching him lead the mare back toward the stable. Something in his gait spoke of weariness far older than his years, a burden he carried with practiced silence. "Thomas," she called softly. He paused, glancing back, and in the pale light his face was striking, sharp planes and shadows, softened only by the vulnerability he tried so hard to conceal. "Thank you," she said, simply. His eyes lingered on hers for a heartbeat too long, before he turned away. By the time Eleanor slipped back into the manor, the household had begun to stir. Her maid fussed over her hair, scolding her for the chill in her cheeks, unaware of the secret that flushed her skin. As she sat before the mirror, allowing the comb to glide through her locks, Eleanor's thoughts remained with the stables, with the boy whose silence spoke louder than words, whose gaze held a story she longed to unravel. The weeks that followed unfurled like pages in a secret book. Each dawn another chapter Eleanor read with a hungry heart. She rose earlier now, anticipation pulling her from the warmth of her bed before the stars had faded. The corridors seemed less forbidding when she knew what awaited her beyond them. The quiet stables, the scent of hay and leather, and Thomas, always Thomas, standing ready, as if he too had been waiting. Their lessons grew bolder. What had begun as cautious circles in the paddock had become daring gallops across the dew-laden fields, the thrum of hooves beneath her, the wind tearing through her hair. Eleanor felt a wildness stir within her, a freedom so intoxicating it left her both exhilarated and frightened. For with every ride, she stepped further from the life her father prescribed, and deeper into a world woven of secrets and stolen moments. Thomas rarely smiled, but when he did, when she coaxed a flicker of amusement from him, she felt as though she had won some great prize. Yet there was always restraint in him, a wall she could not climb. He spoke of the horses with reverence, of the land with a kind of quiet poetry, but of himself he revealed little. It was on a morning heavy with fog that she dared to ask. They had ridden to the edge of the estate where an old oak stood, its branches like outstretched arms. Eleanor slid from her saddle, breathless with laughter, her cloak damp with mist. Thomas dismounted too, his movements steady, practiced. "Tell me something of you," she said, her tone light, though her heart beat hard. "I know little beyond your name," his hand stilled on the reins. For a moment he seemed almost carved from stone, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the fog. "There is little to tell," he said at last. "I do not believe that." Eleanor stepped closer, her voice softening. "You bear scars, Thomas. Not the kind one earns from a horse's kick or a careless nail. They speak of battles fought and lost." His jaw tightened. A muscle flickered in his cheek. "You ask questions that are dangerous, my lady." The words struck her. My lady. He had never addressed her so formally before. It was a reminder of the distance between them, of the gulf of class and station that yawned like a chasm. Yet the way he said it carried another weight, as though he sought to shield her from something darker than gossip or scandal. "Dangerous?" she pressed. "To whom?" Thomas's eyes met hers then, and for the first time she glimpsed the storm behind them. Pain, sharp and unhealed, tempered with defiance. "To those who listen," he said, "and to those who trust too easily." The moment hung heavy between them, charged and unspoken. Eleanor's breath caught, but before she could speak again, the distant toll of the chapel bell cut through the fog. Time, always time, chasing them back into the safety of silence. They returned to the stables in quiet, the air between them taut with questions unasked. Eleanor knew better than to press further, but her curiosity was not so easily dismissed. Secrets had a way of drawing her closer, like the flame of a candle drawing a moth. That evening, As she sat in the drawing room while her father discussed politics with visiting gentlemen, Eleanor found her thoughts wandering. She watched the flames leap in the hearth, imagining them as Thomas's eyes, dark, restless, consuming. She wondered what truths hid behind them. But truth, as she would soon learn, has a way of revealing itself, often at the most unwelcome of moments. It began with whispers. The estate was a place of constant movement. Maids with their baskets of linens, footmen carrying messages, cooks gossiping as they prepared feasts. And where there was movement, there were ears. Eleanor had grown accustomed to being the subject of murmurs, her beauty and her status making her a frequent topic. But one afternoon as she passed the servants' quarters, she heard her own name spoken in hushed conspiratorial tones. "Seen her at the stables," one maid whispered. "Before dawn, no less. With him?" Another replied, her voice low and incredulous. Eleanor froze, her heart stuttering in her chest. She dared not linger, for to eavesdrop would draw suspicion. But the fragments she had heard were enough. Her secret rides were no longer entirely her own. At supper that evening, she found herself studying the faces around the long table. The Duchess, regal and distant. Her younger cousin Lydia, with her ever-watchful eyes. The footman who poured wine and cleared dishes. Who among them knew? And how long before her father discovered it? That night, Eleanor could not sleep. She rose again before dawn, not out of eagerness this time, but out of fear. She needed to see Thomas, to warn him. The stables were quiet, the horses shifting softly in their stalls. She found him mending a bridle, his head bent in concentration. "They know," she whispered urgently, stepping closer. "The servants—" "I heard them speaking. About us." Thomas did not look up immediately. He set the leather aside with careful precision, then lifted his gaze to hers. "Gossip is the breath of this place," he said evenly. "It will pass. But what if it does not?" Eleanor's voice trembled despite herself. "If my father hears—" His eyes softened then, though only slightly. "Then it will be me he casts out, not you." The thought twisted in her chest, sharper than she expected. The idea of Thomas gone, banished from the stables, from her mornings, from her life, was unbearable. "I would not have you pay that price," she said, her voice breaking. Thomas stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, though he did not touch her. His expression was unreadable, but his voice carried a weight that rooted her where she stood. "Every choice has its price, Eleanor. Remember that." Her name on his lips startled her, stripped of title and formality. For the first time, he spoke to her not as the Duke's daughter, but simply as herself. It was a gift, fragile and dangerous. Before she could reply, the distant sound of footsteps reached them. Another stable hand entering, perhaps. Thomas stepped back at once, the distance between them reasserted. The moment folded away like a secret letter returned to its hiding place. But Eleanor carried it with her, pressed against her heart, where it beat all the louder for knowing that their secret world was already beginning to fray. That night, long after the manor had settled into silence, Eleanor stood at her window, the moon casting its silver light over the fields. Somewhere beyond the shadows, Thomas would be sleeping in his small loft above the stables, the horses shifting softly beneath him. She thought of his scars, of the storm in his eyes, of the word dangerous, and she understood, with a shiver that was equal parts fear and longing, that she was already entangled in something far greater than stolen rides at dawn. Whatever secret Thomas carried, it was not merely his burden. It was becoming hers. By the time spring unfurled its blossoms across the Ashworth estate, the air inside the manor felt anything but warm. Eleanor could sense it in the way conversations hushed when she entered a room, the way glances lingered just long enough to sting. Whispers had taken root in the servants' hall, and now they drifted like smoke through the drawing rooms and corridors, reaching ears more dangerous than her own. Her cousin Lydia was the first to betray the change. Lydia, with her keen eyes and a smile too sharp to be sweet, had always envied Eleanor, the Duke's favored child, the beauty of the household, destined for a brilliant match. Yet beneath Lydia's polite compliments simmered a hunger for advantage, and gossip was her chosen weapon. "You've been so very fond of your early walks," Lydia remarked one afternoon, her voice dripping with false innocence as they sat embroidering by the window. "The dawn air must be most invigorating, and most secretive. I cannot think why one would rise so early otherwise." Eleanor kept her hand steady, though the thread trembled in her grasp. "Fresh air is a tonic, cousin. You might try it yourself." Lydia's smile curved. "Oh, I prefer to sleep past sunrise. I find I learn far more by keeping my eyes open after breakfast." The words were innocuous enough, but the glance Lydia cast her held meaning like a knife hidden beneath silk. Eleanor's pulse quickened. The walls were closing in. Their secret was bleeding into the household. That evening she rode harder than she had ever dared, the mare's hooves striking sparks against the earth as she fled into the fields. Thomas followed on another horse, his expression grim, the wind tearing through his dark hair. When at last they slowed, Eleanor dismounted, her breath sharp, her heart tangled in fear. "They know," she said, "or at least they suspect. Lydia watches me," the servants whisper. Thomas dismounted as well, his boots sinking into the damp soil. He regarded her steadily, though the flicker in his eyes betrayed his concern. "It was only a matter of time," he said quietly. "You speak as though you expected it." "I did." His voice was rough, stripped of all softness. "Secrets do not keep, Eleanor. Not in places such as this. Not when bloodlines and reputations are treated like coin." She turned from him, her hands clenched. "Then why did you agree to teach me?" "Why risk it at all?" Silence stretched between them, taut and heavy. At last Thomas stepped closer, his shadow falling across hers. "Because you asked," he said. "And because I could not refuse you." Eleanor looked up, startled by the rawness in his voice. For a fleeting instant, the mask he wore, the careful restraint, the guarded silence, slipped away. What she saw beneath it was not the obedient stable boy, but a man standing at the edge of something perilous, torn between duty and desire. Yet even as her heart quickened, she remembered the scars on his arms, the shadows that haunted him. She could not bear the weight of silence any longer. "Tell me," she whispered. "Whatever it is you hide, tell me. If danger waits, let me see its face." Thomas's gaze hardened, but he did not turn away. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as though surrendering to a tide he had long resisted. "My name is Thomas Hale," he began, but it was not always spoken with quiet disregard. Once, in another county, it was shouted in anger, in judgment. Eleanor's breath caught. "There was a fire," he continued, his voice low, deliberate. "A quarrel with a nobleman's son. Words became blows, and in the struggle the stables burned. They claimed I said it deliberately, that I struck the match out of envy and spite. I swore it was not so, that the fire leapt by accident, but their ears were deaf to a stable boy's plea. A lord's son was injured, his future maimed, and I bore the blame." The wind stirred through the grass, carrying the weight of his confession. Eleanor stared at him, her heart torn between disbelief and aching pity. "Were you guilty?" she asked at last, her voice scarcely above the rustle of leaves. Thomas's jaw clenched. "I am guilty of striking the boy when he mocked my dead father. I am guilty of pride, of fury I could not contain, but I did not light that fire." The pain in his voice was a blade, cutting clean through the distance between them. Eleanor felt it strike her to the core. She believed him. She could not explain why, but she did. Every instinct in her railed against the picture of him as an arsonist, a criminal. The Thomas she knew was steady, careful, bearing his burdens in silence. He was no destroyer, and yet scandal clung to him like ash. If word of his past reached her father's ears, Thomas would not merely be dismissed. He would be ruined, hounded from Ashworth, perhaps even dragged before the law again. "Why tell me now?" Eleanor whispered. "Because you pressed me," he replied, his voice heavy with warning. "And because once you know, you cannot unknow. You share my burden now. That is a dangerous place to stand." Eleanor lifted her chin, her resolve burning through her fear. "Then I will stand in it. Whatever comes, Thomas, I would rather face it with truth than with silence." For a moment, something fierce flashed in his eyes, admiration, perhaps even longing, but it was gone in an instant, replaced once more by that practiced restraint. He turned away, gathering the reins of his horse. "Go back to the manor," he said. "If you value your place, your safety, go." But Eleanor did not move. She watched him mount and ride off, his figure swallowed by the fading light. And though he had urged her to turn back, she knew her heart had already crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The days that followed pressed on Eleanor like a tightening noose. Lydia's watchfulness grew keener, her questions more barbed. At supper, she would remark slyly upon the mud on Eleanor's boots or the faint smell of hay clinging to her cloak. Their father, distracted with affairs of state, paid little heed, but Eleanor knew it was only a matter of time before suspicion sharpened into accusation. One evening, as the candles guttered low in the drawing room, Lydia leaned close, her breath warm against Eleanor's ear. "Do be careful, cousin," she murmured. "A duke's daughter is meant to ride in carriages, not scandal. Tongues wag so easily, and once they do, no embroidery can stitch them shut." Eleanor stiffened, her hand tightening around her embroidery hoop. She did not trust herself to answer, for fear her voice would betray the tremor of both fear and defiance within her. That night, she dreamt of fire, horses screaming, flames licking at wooden beams, Thomas standing in the inferno with shadows clawing at him. She woke with her heart pounding, the echo of smoke in her throat. She knew then that the whispers would not fade, that Lydia's threats would not end. The secret she and Thomas shared was no longer safe, and yet, even as danger circled closer, Eleanor felt her heart bound ever more tightly to his. It was as though the peril itself drew them together, forging a bond that defied reason. She knew what she risked: her father's wrath, her family's honor, her own place in the world. But she also knew this: she could not let go. The Ashworth estate glowed golden in the dying light of day, but for Eleanor Whitcombe, dusk had never felt so heavy nor so cruel. Shadows lengthened across the manicured lawns, creeping closer like fingers of fate, and within the Duke's great hall, plans were being laid for her future, plans that would sever her from the secret mornings she cherished most. It began with a summons. Her father had requested her presence in his study, a place of maps and ledgers and stern portraits of ancestors who seemed to scowl down upon her. The Duke sat behind his oak desk, his hair silvering at the temples, his gaze sharp with the authority that had governed lands and people alike. Beside him stood Lydia, her cousin's smile sweet as honey and just as sticky. "You are nearly 19, Eleanor," the Duke began, his tone brooking no protest. "It is time we secured your future. Lord Rathbourne has expressed interest. His title is ancient, his fortune considerable, and his influence invaluable to our family." Eleanor's stomach turned. Viscount Rathbourne was nearly twice her age, a man whose eyes lingered too long on women and whose laughter carried the sourness of arrogance. To be bound to him was unthinkable. "Father," she began, but he silenced her with a raised hand. "You will meet him formally at the midsummer ball. The engagement will be announced thereafter. This is settled." And with those words, he returned to his papers, dismissing her as though she were a servant awaiting orders. Lydia's gaze followed Eleanor as she left, her smile curving with satisfaction. It was then Eleanor knew. Lydia had poisoned her father's ear, feeding him whispers until he bound her with shackles far heavier than any chain. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Eleanor fled to the stables. Her steps quickened with desperation, her breath ragged with fear. She found Thomas there, brushing down a mare, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, his presence as steady as the earth itself. But when she rushed to him, when she spilled the words of her father's decree, she saw something in his face that frightened her more than Rathbourne's name. Resignation. "You knew this day would come," he said quietly. "No," Eleanor insisted, her voice breaking. "Not like this." "Not to him." Thomas set aside the brush, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Eleanor, you are a duke's daughter. You were never meant to belong here in these stables, in these stolen mornings. Your father would see you raised higher. I cannot stand in his way." Her heart twisted. "But you already stand in it," she whispered. "Every morning, every glance, every word between us. Do not tell me we are nothing, Thomas. Do not tell me that." His silence was an answer she could not bear. She stepped closer, searching his eyes, desperate to tear down the walls he held around himself. But before either could speak further, a shout rang out across the courtyard. 2 footmen entered, followed by the estate steward, their faces grim. And behind them, Lydia, her expression alight with triumph. "There he is," she declared, pointing at Thomas. "The Duke must hear of this." Eleanor's blood turned cold. "Lydia, stop!" But the men were already moving forward. "By order of the Duke," the steward intoned, "Thomas Hale, you are accused of theft and deceit. You are to be confined until the magistrate arrives." "Theft?" Eleanor cried. "That is absurd!" Yet the footman held up a small velvet pouch, its contents spilling gold coins that gleamed in the fading light. Eleanor's heart clenched. She knew instantly it was a trap, the work of Lydia's malice. But her protests fell on deaf ears. Thomas stood still, his expression unreadable, his hands lowered, though his shoulders coiled with restrained fury. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice fierce. "His word means everything to me." The men hesitated, startled by her defiance, but Lydia only arched a brow. "Oh, cousin, what curious loyalty you show a servant. One might almost mistake it for affection." Her words slithered into the air, and with them, the truth Eleanor had fought so hard to keep hidden. The glances exchanged, the whispers of gossip, now they bloomed into certainty. A duke's daughter entangled with a stable boy. Scandal, ripe and damning. The steward's face hardened. "My lady, it is not fitting for you to speak so in his defense. Best return to the house." But Eleanor stood her ground. "No. If he is accused, then accuse me as well. For I have ridden with him at dawn, I have spoken with him in secret, and I will not let him bear this alone." Gasps rippled through the stable yard. Even Thomas looked at her, his eyes wide with shock. For Eleanor had bared her soul, thrown off the veil of secrecy, and stood in defiance of her station. "Eleanor," he murmured, his voice breaking with equal parts awe and despair. "What have you done?" But before she could answer, the footmen seized him, binding his wrists with coarse rope. Eleanor lunged forward, but Thomas shook his head, his gaze pleading. "Do not fight them," he whispered. "Not for me." Her tears blurred the sight of him being dragged away, his figure swallowed by the gathering dusk. And in that moment, the world Eleanor knew, of balls and carriages, of fine gowns and polished silver, collapsed into ruin. She was left standing in the stable yard, the smell of hay and leather sharp in her lungs, her hands trembling with helpless rage. Lydia's laughter echoed faintly behind her, cruel and victorious, as the last light of day bled into darkness. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her chamber, the moonlight tracing silver across her tear-streaked face. Her father's footsteps passed the corridor once, firm and unyielding, before silence fell again. She knew he would not relent. Thomas would be delivered to the magistrate, his past crimes resurrected, his fate sealed, but Eleanor's heart had already chosen its course. She rose from her bed, her breath steady now, her hands certain. Whatever scandal, whatever wrath awaited her, she could not, would not, let Thomas fall alone. And so, as the manor slept, Eleanor Whitcombe made a vow in the darkness that before the next dusk, she would find him. The morning broke in silence, heavy and gray as though the heavens themselves mourned. Within the walls of Ashworth Manor, the household stirred, oblivious to the storm that brewed in Eleanor's heart. She moved swiftly through the corridors, cloaked in the half-light, her steps purposeful, her breath steady. Every instinct screamed of danger, but her resolve had hardened into steel. She had learned the truth from a maid loyal to her. Thomas was locked in the old storage loft above the stables, awaiting the arrival of the magistrate. By evening, he would be marched from the estate in chains, his fate sealed by Lydia's lies and her father's stern decree. Unless Eleanor reached him first. The air outside was sharp with the scent of dew and earth. She hurried across the courtyard, her cloak drawn tight, her heart hammering. The stables loomed ahead, familiar and yet changed. No longer the sanctuary of stolen mornings, but a prison holding the man she loved. She slipped inside. The horses stirred softly, their eyes catching the lantern light as she climbed the narrow stairs to the loft. The door was barred but not locked, and when she pushed it open, the sight that greeted her stole her breath. Thomas sat against the wall, his wrists bound, his head bowed. He looked up as she entered, and in his eyes, dark, unbroken, she saw both weariness and astonishment. "Eleanor," he whispered, "you should not be here." She fell to her knees beside him, fumbling with the rope that bit into his skin. "And leave you to their lies? Never." His voice was low, urgent. "If they find you—" "Then let them," she cut in, her hands trembling as she freed him. "I will not live in gilded cages while you are dragged to ruin. We must go, Thomas. Now." For a moment he only stared, as though he could not believe she meant it. Then, with a surge of strength, he tore the last knot free and seized her hands in his. "You would leave everything?" he asked, his voice raw. "Yes," she said fiercely. "For you, yes." A silence fell, charged and absolute. Then Thomas rose, pulling her with him. "Then we ride." They moved quickly, every step a gamble. Eleanor led him to the tack room, where saddles hung in neat rows, and together they prepared 2 horses with practiced haste. Thomas's hands, though raw from rope, worked swiftly, his movements sure. "Which way?" Eleanor whispered. "South," he said. "Toward the forest. The magistrate will come by the northern road. We'll have a chance." But even as they mounted, the sound of voices carried across the courtyard. Shouts, hurried footsteps. The alarm had been raised. "Go!" Thomas urged, spurring his horse into motion. Eleanor followed, the mare surging beneath her with a strength that made her breath catch. The stable doors burst open, and they thundered into the morning, the world blurring around them.